Again, thank you very much for inviting me along today to talk to you. I'm going to briefly try and cover how NHS Blood and Transplant, in particular the organ donation and transplant sector within, or directorate within NHS Blood and Transplant, is trying to help facilitate research, and how we and the sort of the problems that we face as an organisation in trying to do that. So I shall move on. So I mean, the problem is with NHS Blood and Transplant, our primary role is that we are there to provide organs and tissues for transplantation purposes, and that is the primary drive. Historically, therefore, I think research, although it's been something that very much has been supported by NHS Blood and Transplant, is something that's had to take a little bit of a backseat, and particularly with historically when before the merger of the National Blood Service and UK Transplant. UK Transplant was a very small organisation with very little resources, and primarily had to focus its research-related activity around clinical audit and looking at development of models of selection and allocation and the outcomes of organs. So it hasn't had a real focus on looking at sort of the clinical work that's now being done. Again, I think just recently, one of the directors, and as a part of this, in the merger of the two organisations, there's a real one of the directions now for NHS Blood and Transplant and for ODT is to actually actively commission and fund and support research specifically around transplant-related research. And again, this sort of merger has allowed ODT now to have access to some of the funding that NHS sort of MBS has historically had, and has given it a much more emphasis and more sort of financial sort of authority to be able to go ahead and start looking at driving some sort of research forward particularly with organ donation and transplantation. So how are we managing sort of the retrieval of organs for research? And as I said, taking aside the primary role of NHS Blood and Transplant, we are currently we've introduced a new management process to approve studies, and I know there's a number of people in the audience who we've worked with to try and get through that process. And we currently are supporting 21 active studies. We have another 7 in the pipeline waiting to come on board, who want to access organs and tissues for their research. Most of those are transplant-related research, but there are a number of other research studies where they're looking for the sort of non-transplant related stuff. And obviously, one of the other things we've always traditionally supported is commercial aspects of research through the research tissue banks, such as Absolute. The main I suppose the major process within gaining access to organs for research is the consent. And we have now almost tripled the number of specialist nurses in organ donation over the last 3 or 4 years. So there's a much greater number of people out there to be able to gain consent for research. And we have to go and sit there and talk to the families of the donors. So without their support, we aren't going to be able to obtain or gain any access to organs, tissues to start with. We've also recognised that within the current consent documentation that is used within ODT is that it actually only asks for consent for non-transplantable organs. So if anybody wants to come along and use organs for specifically and purely for research, and obviously we've touched very, very strongly already on the licensing issues, and I will talk about how that is impacting on us and how we are trying to address some of those issues in partnership with other groups in the moment. But it requires a specific consent for research. So, for instance, when we've got a specialist nurse who's going out and talking to a family who are, as I say, in an acute bereaved state, they've just been told that their loved one is either died because they're brainstem dead, or is likely to die because they're going to withdraw treatment, and we're offering the option of organ donation. They've then got to consider, donating, possibly 8 organs, 12 different tissues, And then we're going to come and talk to them about specific consent for different research projects as well. So there's an awful lot for the family to take on board. So again, this is something that as an organisation is one of the reasons why we want to try quite sort of tightly regulate the amount of specific consent for research that we take, and which is why we would ideally like to try and work with the research tissue banks, because we can then just take a generic research consent that allows tissues to be taken from a donor with the consent of that family under their appropriate licensing, and that would go to a tissue bank, and a researcher would apply to the tissue bank to access that tissue. That would be probably the most sensible and straightforward solution. But unfortunately, as I say, various regulations, various factors are causing issues with being able to take that forwards. One of the other types of things we've got to take into account is the amount of research that's now being done on organs that are going to be transplanted. And again, the UK Donation Ethics Committee recently wrote a document which highlighted the fact that we haven't got consent in this country at the moment for that to happen. And the suggestion is, without overly complicating things, is that we should give that allow the donors' families to give consent for the use of the organ after it's been retrieved, before it is transplanted. And there's a kind of issue, a grey area around who actually owns that organ. Is it the donor, or is it, and can the donor family give permission for that organ to be used, or should it be given that? Should we be asking the recipient for that consent for their organ to be used? And I think there's a grey area. I mean, personally, I think to keep things simple, we are talking to the donor family. We're taking consent from the donor family at the very beginning. So I think therefore we should give that consent to the family. If they say yes, the organ's going to be retrieved. It becomes difficult if we then talk to the recipient afterwards and say, right, well, do you accept this organ once it's had research done upon it? And they say no. Then we've lost, we're in a position where we have an organ that can't be used, potentially. So that's the consent is a big, complex issue. That has been addressed, and we have produced some new documentation within Organs, Donation and Transplant, which is going through and is going to be passed through to the Human Tissue Authority and our lawyers to be looked at to make sure it fits into the appropriate legislation. That should hopefully make asking for research much more simpler, and make it put the emphasis on asking for a generic consent. And again, this is something that I would go out to researchers is when you're applying for your ethics committee approval, to come and talk to us first and see how we can work with you. And if we can say, yes, this will fit into a generic approach for consent, and that will make things much easier for the people asking for consent, and also for the families who are having to give consent, and they can say, yes, I'd like to give to research. I don't really, and a lot of people say, I don't really care what research it's going for, as long as it is benefiting people, and there is a positive outcome coming from it. And when we do talk to families, 70 to 80% of families will say yes to the use of organs and tissues for research. I've got some figures to show you shortly, to show you how very little and few organs and tissues are currently being used. Organ retrieval and the retrieval of organs for transplantation and for research is currently undertaken either by the NORS teams, which are the National Organ Retrieval Team service teams within the UK, who will retrieve all the livers, kidneys, pancreas, whatever it is that can be used for transplant, or in certain circumstances where we've got specific consent for research being done, some of the research team members will come into the hospital, generally for the surgeons, and will come and retrieve tissue themselves. The thing is, as I said, we're looking at, we've found a growing number of researchers coming to us wanting to access organs and tissues for research. Obviously, we've touched on the fact that there is a massive gap between the number of organs available for transplantation and the number of people waiting on a transplant list. And as was mentioned earlier on, 3 people every day will die waiting for a transplant. So it's really, really important that we're there to try and support research and to try and increase the number of organs that can be used for transplantation purposes. And it is only through research that we're going to be able to push that through forwards. So the impact on NHS at the moment, as I say, the system that we are using is hopefully that we've introduced is going to be able to provide a greater access to untransplantable organs, and hopefully in a more realistic amount, because the problem is that, as I say, there are very small numbers of organs that become available for research. And last year I asked our statistics department to do a quick review of the number of organs that were taken and went for research, and of all the organs that were taken, there were 192 organs that went for research last year. in the UK, which is a very, very small amount. And when we looked at, I mean, one of the things that Jackie says is that, you know, accessing organs from a deceased organ donor purely for research has virtually come to a standstill in this country. And I asked them to find those figures out for me, and there were 2 organs that were taken purely for research that went on and were used in research, and those were both pancreas, where they were isolating islets from those organs, which is shocking. Particularly when you've got, as I say, we've got 70 to 80% of the donors' families quite happy for organs to go for research. They sign the consent paperwork, but because of the licensing issues, we cannot go into theatres and retrieve organs and take them just for research. And there's a huge untapped sort of opportunity there that is being missed. And again, it's something that NHS Blood and Transplant is very much aware of, and would very much like to try and push that forward and try and resolve those issues. As an organisation, we're working very closely with the various regulatory authorities, working with the Human Tissue Authority to try and address that. And we recognise, again, the Human Tissue Authority is there to sort of make sure the legislation is followed, and are as keen to try and do something about the issues that the Act is creating as we are, and to try and help research as much as possible. I think they've only recently been through various avenues of pressure coming from different people, come to understand how much of a difficult issue this is, and how much of an impact the lack of access to organs for research is actually causing to research in the UK across the whole of the sectors. One I just wanted to very quickly talk about this as a study that NHS Blood and Transplant has recently funded, and this is the Quad study. This is looking at trying to improve the quality of organs from organ donors in order to be able to so that hopefully organs that are coming from the marginal donors are improved and will be more likely to be transplanted in the future. But this study it will be a national study across the whole of the UK, and will require taking various samples from a potential donor throughout the whole of their process, from when they were first admitted through to going into theatres. And with a brainstem dead donor, that will require a licence extension not only to theatres, but also to the intensive care units, potentially the A&E units, and potentially to the sort of theatre areas outside of the main theatres where a patient may be kept prior to going for research, which is potentially going to be a huge amount of work. I mean, if I tell you, I think on my next study, and there's a slider in front of myself, but we undertook a brief survey through the specialist nurses who are working within their trusts throughout the UK to look at the number of licence extensions that have already been in place. And I've been working with the specialist nurses now for 9 months to try and extend licences into hospitals to try and resolve these issues. And unfortunately they came back, and I was really disappointed, but they came back and they told us there are only 27 hospitals in England, Wales and Northern Ireland that have got an extension to cover theatres. There are probably another 5 or 6 hospitals where they've applied for the licence but have not heard back as to actually whether it's been extended or not. But again, it's still very, very small numbers. So, as I say, there are people out there, and there's a huge reticence from the Norse teams to go into trusts and say, well, we don't know whether it is or it isn't. The SNODs don't really know what they're supposed to be doing. The DIs within the hospitals are very reluctant to take the risk that they may, that they're allowing a process to happen that's outside of their remit, outside of their control. So they're very reluctant to put it into place. So it has become a bit of a mess, and there really does need to be a new emphasis on this. I'll move on from time's perspective. This is just to show you that ODT had really had to sort of try to address some of the issues, and is putting into place its own research strategy to try and address how it deals with research within the UK. So I'll say what has been done about it. One of the things we do recognise we need to do, apart from dealing with the post-mortem licence strategy, is to actually develop some sort of allocation system. As I say, we've got 21 studies wanting to access organs from donors. There are currently 9 of those studies that want to access kidneys. And last year there were a total of 62 kidneys that were donated for research. It's a very finite pool, and there's a huge competition for those organs that's going to exist. So we need to put into place a very clear transparent process to be able to allow the different research projects to have equal access to that pool of organs, as well as trying to expand the number of organs that become available. And that's something that we need to sit with with the transplant community itself to look at what sort of allocation system would be acceptable. And I think that's a really important and vital piece of work that needs doing quite quickly. So, as I say, one of the things we're doing with it is to work very closely with the HGA, and there's a joint, again, and I think although Victoria mentioned that there is a very firm reluctance to reopen the legislation, I think we recognise, along with the HGA, that unless the legislation is reopened and is changed fundamentally, that this is going to be a long, long haul to be able to get enough hospitals with licence extensions in place to be able to allow meaningful numbers of organs to be able to be released for research. We're also working very closely with the hospitals itself. Well, that's a very, very slow process, and the specialist nurses are going out there trying to talk to the DIs, trying to find out who the DIs are in some of the hospitals. Is very difficult in itself, but they are trying to work very closely. But again, it's a long, long uphill battle, unfortunately. And as I say, there's another 240 plus hospitals to go to be able to get the whole of the UK covered by the licences. So in conclusion, as an organisation, NHS Blood and Transplant is developing a new emphasis on research and a reactive and proactive system to try and deal with research within the UK. We have directions directly to get us to actually start supporting and funding our own research within organ donation and transplantation. And we're implementing a strong strategy to try and deal with that. And we're obviously trying to work in partnership with various internal and external bodies. So we're working within NHS Blood and Transplant, with the tissue services side of things, the stem cell banks, to try and look at how we can work as a single organisation. So we all got different products, non-clinical products that can go to research. Why aren't we working as one organisation rather than as a splintered different factors going on? I had a researcher come to me who wanted to access kidneys and blood, and I said, unfortunately you can come to me for kidneys, but you've got to go to another guy and talk to another part of the organisation and go through their approval processes to get hold of blood, which again seems very bureaucratic and nonsensical, really. But also to work closely with the tissue banks to say, how can we work with you? How can as an organisation facilitate research and allow more access to organs and tissues? Thank you.